This is Mr. Oscar, and today we will talk about something that took me longer to admit than almost anything else in my life. Not procrastination, not burnout, not poor time management, fear of failure. Now, before you think you already know where this is going, I want you to stay with me. Because this is not a video about how failure is good for you. It is not a highlight reel of successful people who failed first. I am not going to read you a list of entrepreneurs who went bankrupt before they made their first billion. This is a conversation about something much quieter, much more personal, and for most people I have met, far more damaging than failure itself. It is the relationship between who you believe you are and what happens when you don't succeed. Because here is what I have come to understand after everything I've lived through. Most people are not actually afraid of the failure. They are afraid of what the failure means about them. They are afraid that if they try and fall short, the evidence will finally confirm the thing they have been secretly terrified of their whole life. That maybe they are just not good enough. That maybe the potential everyone saw in them was never real. That maybe this is just who they are. If you have ever stopped yourself from starting something, really stopped yourself, and you couldn't explain why, I think this is what was underneath it. And I want to spend the next few minutes sitting inside that with you. Because a researcher named Carol Dweck spent decades studying exactly this. And what she found changed the way I understand myself completely. I want to take you back to a period of my life I rarely talk about in full. After my business collapsed in 2011, and I have mentioned that collapse before on this channel, there was a window of about 2 years where I essentially stopped trying, not openly. I still showed up. I still had conversations about what I was going to build next. I still attended the meetings and wrote the plans and talked with the kind of energy that made people think I was moving forward. But I wasn't. Not really. Because every time I got close to committing to something new, really committing, putting my name on it, stepping into the risk of it, something would pull me back. A reason would appear. The timing wasn't right. The market had shifted. I needed to do more research. I needed to be more prepared. And I believed every single excuse. Because they felt rational. They felt responsible even. Like I was being careful. Like I had learned from my mistakes. But one evening, I was sitting with a very old friend of mine, a man named Roland, who had known me since before any of the success and long after the failure. And he said something that cracked me open. He said, "Oscar, you are one of the most prepared, unprepared people I have ever known. You prepare for everything except actually doing it." I laughed at the time. But that night I couldn't sleep, because I realized he was right. And the question that kept me awake wasn't, why am I not doing more? The question was, what am I actually afraid of? And the honest answer, the one I had never let myself fully say out loud, was this. I was afraid that if I tried again and failed again, it would mean the first failure wasn't bad luck or bad timing. It would mean it was me, that I was the problem, that I was the variable that kept producing the same result. I was not afraid of failure. I was afraid of what a second failure would permanently say about my identity. And that fear, quiet, invisible, dressed up as preparation and patience, had been running my life for 2 years without me even knowing it had a name. The shift didn't happen all at once. Rarely does. It started with a conversation I had with a therapist I was seeing at the time. A woman who had a gift for asking the one question you were hoping she wouldn't. She asked me one afternoon, "When you imagine trying something new and failing, what do you tell yourself that failure means?" And I sat with that for a long time. Because I had never separated the event of failing from the story, I told myself about what the failing meant about me as a person. She pointed me toward the work of Carol Dweck. She didn't give me a lecture about it. She just said, "Read her work on mindset and identity. I think you'll recognize yourself in it." I did, almost immediately. Carol Dweck is a psychologist at Stanford University. She has spent over 40 years studying one of the most fundamental questions in human psychology. Why do some people grow through difficulty while others collapse under it? Her answer, backed by decades of research across thousands of subjects from children in classrooms to adults in high-performance careers, comes down to something she calls mindset. Specifically, the difference between what she calls a fixed mindset and a growth mindset. Now, I know those words have been used so many times they can start to feel empty. But I want to go deeper than the surface version of this idea, because the surface version misses what Dweck is actually saying about identity. Here is the core of it. A person with a fixed mindset believes that their qualities, their intelligence, their talent, their capability, are carved in stone. They are either gifted or they are not. They either have what it takes or they don't. And because they believe this, every challenge, every test, every moment of difficulty becomes a referendum on who they fundamentally are. Failure, for a fixed mindset person, is not an event. It is a verdict. And this is where I recognize myself completely. Because when my business failed, I didn't just lose a company. In my mind, without ever saying it clearly, I had failed as a person. The two things had become the same thing. My identity and my outcome had merged, and that merger was what made trying again feel so dangerous. Dweck's research shows this pattern is extraordinarily common. In one of her most cited studies, she gave two groups of children a series of problems to solve. One group was praised for their intelligence. You're so smart. The other group was praised for their effort. You worked really hard on that. What happened next was remarkable. The children praised for intelligence, the ones who had been told their success came from who they were, became afraid to take on harder challenges. They avoided tasks where they might fail. They chose easy problems over difficult ones. Because if they failed at something hard, it would undermine the very identity they had been given. The children praised for effort, the ones who had been told their success came from what they did, actively sought harder challenges. They saw difficulty as information. They saw failure as something to learn from rather than something to hide from. Same age, same classroom, completely different relationship with failure, created by nothing more than the way they understood the source of their own success. Dweck calls this the most powerful mindset research of her career, and the implications go far beyond children in classrooms. She found the same pattern in adults, in athletes, in professionals, in people who had every external resource to succeed and still couldn't bring themselves to take the risk. Because their identity was so tightly fused to their performance that the risk of failure felt like the risk of erasure. This is also supported by the work of Albert Bandura, the psychologist at Stanford who developed the concept of self-efficacy, which is essentially your belief in your own ability to execute. Bandura found that self-efficacy is not built by success alone. It is built most powerfully through what he called mastery experiences, the act of attempting something difficult, struggling with it, and persisting through the struggle. The struggle itself, Bandura found, is what builds the deep confidence that doesn't shatter under pressure. In other words, avoiding failure to protect your identity is the very thing that prevents you from building the identity that doesn't need protecting. Read that again if you need to. The avoidance that feels like self-protection is actually the mechanism that keeps you fragile. There is also research from Brené Brown, the research professor at the University of Houston, who has spent 2 decades studying vulnerability, shame, and courage. Brown found in her research that shame, which she defines as the intensely painful feeling that we are flawed and therefore unworthy, is almost always rooted in the fusion of identity and performance. We feel shame not when we fail, but when we believe our failure makes us a failure. Brown's work shows that this shame is the single greatest predictor of disengagement, the quiet withdrawal from risk, from connection, from the very attempts that would move our lives forward. She says something that I have carried with me since I first read it. She says, "You cannot shame yourself into courage," and that landed heavily for me, because for years, that is exactly what I was doing. Every time I didn't execute, I would stand in the mirror and tell myself I was weak. I was broken. I was not the man I was supposed to be, and then I would wonder why I still couldn't move. Shame was never going to get me moving. It was only ever going to keep me hiding. So here is the practical shift I want to give you today. One thing, concrete and usable from this moment forward. I want you to begin separating your identity from your outcomes, deliberately, in writing, starting today. Here is how. The next time you face something you have been avoiding, a project you haven't started, a conversation you keep delaying, a commitment you keep softening, I want you to write down the answer to this question honestly. If I try this and it doesn't work, what do I believe that means about me as a person? Write the actual answer. Don't clean it up. Don't make it rational. Write the raw belief. Because Dweck's research shows that the first step in shifting from a fixed mindset to a growth mindset is not positive thinking. It is awareness. It is catching the fixed mindset voice, the one that says your failure is your identity, in the act. She calls this process of catching the voice and responding to it the foundation of mindset change. Not a one-time switch, a practice. Once you have written the belief, I want you to write one sentence underneath it that separates the event from the verdict. Something like, "This result doesn't define my capacity. It defines my current level of skill and information, both of which can change." That is not a pep talk. That is what Dweck's research actually shows is happening inside the brains of growth mindset individuals. They are not more talented. They are not more fearless. They simply have a different internal narrative running between the moment of difficulty and the moment of decision. Peter Gollwitzer's research on implementation intentions, which I have referenced before, also applies here. He found that if you pre-decide your response to obstacles before they appear, what he calls an if-then plan, you are dramatically more likely to continue in the face of difficulty. So you can also write, if I feel the pull to stop because I'm afraid of what failure means, then I will remind myself that the attempt is the identity, not the outcome. That is your protection. Not from failure, from the story you tell yourself about what failure means. I want to close with something personal. The second business I built after everything collapsed, it didn't start with confidence. It didn't start with certainty. It started with a very deliberate decision to uncouple my sense of self from whether or not it worked. I told myself, I am not a success or a failure. I am a man who attempts things, learns from them, and adjusts. That is my identity. The outcome is just data. It sounds simple. It was not simple. It took months of catching the fixed mindset voice mid-sentence and choosing a different response. Some days I still catch it. Some days it catches me first. But what Carol Dweck gave me, without ever knowing my name, was the understanding that the fear I had been living under was not a personality trait. It was a learned pattern of thinking. And learned patterns can be unlearned. New ones can be built in their place. You are not someone who is afraid to fail. You are someone who was never taught to separate who you are from what happens when you try. That separation is learnable, it is buildable, and it starts the moment you decide that the attempt itself is the identity, not the outcome. I'm Mr. Oscar. This is Execution Psychology, and I will see you in the next one.